Hi, thanks for tuning in to the Copyright Chat channel. My name is Sarah Benson and I'm the Copyright Librarian at the University Library. If you're watching this video, you're probably wondering whether you can use someone else's work for educational purposes without asking for permission first. You've come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to discuss some common copyright myths, fair use, and how to apply it. But first, let's discuss some common copyright myths. One common myth is that everything on the internet is copyright free. That's incorrect. In fact, one of the rights of a copyright owner is to distribute her work in the way she sees fit. Another copyright myth is one that says that you need permission from the copyright owner to use a copyrighted work. That is not true if your use of the work is a fair use. Finally, some folks think that if you're using a work for an educational purpose, it's automatically fair use. Also false. As you will learn in the rest of this video, fair use is a case-by-case analysis, and just because a particular use is educational does not necessarily mean that it is a fair use. So, what is a fair use? Well, fair use is a limitation on the rights of the copyright holder or owner. It allows the person wishing to use the copyrighted work to use the work without first obtaining permission from the copyright owner. But fair use must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. For instance, if you wish to use 20 photographs in a thesis, you would need to assess whether each use of the individual photograph constitutes a fair use. So you'd have to look at fair use 20 individual times. Finally, fair use is an affirmative defense. This means that you can be sued for copyright infringement and you would have to respond to the lawsuit to assert fair use in court. Thus, you should always do a risk assessment when deciding whether a particular use is a fair use. A risk assessment generally looks at what you think the risk might be of being sued for this particular use. For instance, using the work of a famous artist in a publicly displayed website might be a higher risk than emailing an obscure artist's work to your friend. Fair use is codified in Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 107. In the preamble or the introduction to the statute, it says, quote, "The fair use of a copyrighted work for purposes such as teaching, scholarship, or research is not an infringement of copyright," end quote. That's good news for educators because most of what we do at the university is for teaching, scholarship, and for research. But the statute does not end there. Congress continues to tell us that in considering fair use, we must examine 4 factors. First, the purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is of a commercial nature or is for a nonprofit educational purpose. Second, the nature of the copyrighted work. Third, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And fourth, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Fair use is by far the most litigated aspect of copyright law. That's both good news and bad news. The bad news is lots of people get sued for asserting fair use. But the good news is that all of these cases tell us a bit more what each factor of the fair use test means. I like to discuss fair use on a spectrum. Although this is a bit of an oversimplification, you will see that the uses move further to the right of the spectrum. That shows that they're more likely to be a fair use. And uses that move to the left are less likely to be a fair use. Of course, all of the factors need to be weighed against one another, so just because one factor weighs against fair use does not necessarily mean that a particular use case is not a fair use. Let's look at the factors each in turn. For the first factor, the purpose and character of the use. The more educational the use, the more likely the use is to be a fair use. This factor is generally a favorable one for many of the things that we do at the university, such as using works for teaching purposes. Whereas, the more commercial the use, the less likely the use is to be a fair use. The second factor is the nature of the underlying work. The courts lately tend to give this factor less weight, but it still must be taken into account. If the underlying work being used is factual or historical, it is more likely to be a fair use to use the work, while if it is a highly creative work, it is less likely to be considered a fair use. The third factor takes into consideration how much of the underlying work is used. If you take small parts of the work, it is more likely to be considered a fair use. But if you take the entire work or the heart of the work, which means the most important part of the work, it is less likely to be a fair use. And finally, we must consider whether you are impacting the market value or potential market value of the underlying work. If you are, then it is less likely to be a fair use. But if your new work would not supplant the market value for the original, it's more likely to be a fair use. Let's take a quick example. Pretend for a moment that I'm a graduate student in women's studies. I'm writing a thesis about how the character Hermione from Harry Potter personifies the third wave of feminism. In order to write my thesis, I must quote quite a bit from the Harry Potter series and at times make use of block quotations consisting of 50 words or more. Let's use a long block quote consisting of 80 words as an example. Consider whether this particular block quote is a fair use. Under the first factor, it's an educational use, so that is more likely to be a fair use. Under the second factor, Harry Potter is highly creative, so it's not as likely to be a fair use. Under the third factor, I'm using just a small portion of the entire book, so it's more likely to be a fair use. And finally, am I likely to supplant the market for Harry Potter with my thesis? Unlikely. If someone wants to read Harry Potter, reading my thesis would be a pretty poor substitute. Thus, overall, it is likely a fair use. But wait, there's another important factor to consider. In 1994, the Supreme Court interpreted the purpose and character factor to include an additional consideration, whether a work was transformative. I call this factor 1+, because it stems out of the first factor of the test. In the Campbell case, the court said that a transformative work is one that, quote, alters the original work with a new meaning, message, or expression. And since 1994, courts have been giving the transformative factor more and more weight. Some might even say that, like Pac-Man here, the transformative factor is influencing all of the other factors. Courts will say things like, the artist took the entire work under factor 3, but is transformative, so they had to do it. Note, transformative works are different than just copying. If you're simply copying a chapter of a book to put it in your course management system, that is not transformative. In order to make something transformative, you must give it a new character or meaning. Like if you put something into a PowerPoint and discuss it extensively, that could be transformative. When you're dealing with a transformative work, here are a few questions you can ask yourself. First, does the use of the copyrighted material help me to make my point? If not, it's not likely transformative. You're probably just using the work to make your PowerPoint look pretty, and it's likely not to be a fair use. Second, will the use of the work help my readers to get the point that I'm trying to make? And third, have I used just the right amount to help my readers get the point? And note, just the right amount might be the entire thing. If the answer to all of these questions is yes, it's likely a fair use and a transformative fair use at that. Let's look at a transformative use example from a real case. This is one of my favorite case examples because it involves the band The Grateful Dead. A true Grateful Dead fan wrote an anthology of the Dead. He wanted to include posters from the shows in the book. He asked the artist who made the posters if he could use them in the book, and the artist told him no. So he did it anyways, and unsurprisingly, he got sued. His publisher defended the lawsuit. In the book, the posters were smaller and put into a timeline to show what was happening at the time with the band. The court found that it was a transformative fair use. Why? Even though the book was commercial, the court found that the purpose of the original posters was to promote the shows for the band's performances. The purpose of the posters in the book was to place the band's work into historical context, which was a new purpose and meaning and message, and thus transformative. Are you still a bit afraid of asserting fair use? Here's some information that should ease your mind a bit. According to the Copyright Act, employees of nonprofit educational institutions, such as the University of Illinois, cannot be held liable for statutory damages, those big damages of up to $150,000 per violation, as long as they made a reasonable good faith belief that their particular use was a fair use. So, if you think through fair use, are reasonable, and make a good faith determination of each assertion of fair use on a case-by-case basis, remember, you can't just say everything educational is fair use, then you have some protection from large damages. That's really good news. So, you might use a fair use checklist to help document your fair use decisions, such as the one made by Kenneth Cruz or the one advertised through the American Library Association. In any event, do think through the fair use factors, including whether your use is transformative. And if you still have questions, consult my library guide at guides.library.illinois.edu/copyright reference guide or contact me at srbenson@illinois.edu. I'm here to help. Thanks for watching.